Simon has been coming to Politics in Prose on a regular basis ever since The Professor and the Madman, that book of his recounting the story of the making of the OED. And there have been many best-selling books ever since then, including Krakatoa and The Man Who Loved China. And I always know it's going to be a fascinating evening when Simon comes. Actually, the seed of this book, his new book, The Men Who United the States, was planted about 50 years ago when Simon first came to this country. After graduating from secondary school in the UK, Simon, he recounted this in an interview, worked in a mortuary to earn money to come for his passage to Canada. Is that right, Simon? Yes. That paid for his passage to Canada, and from Canada, he hitchhiked across the United States around America for 6 months, and in the process, he developed a lifelong passion for this country. But he returned home, got his degree in geology from St. Catherine's College at Oxford, and secured his first job as a geologist in Uganda. But that was his first and only job as a geologist, because he left it to become a writer and then a journalist. In 1972, he was posted to Washington as the American correspondent for The Guardian. But even the Nixon administration and the Watergate that he was covering couldn't dampen his passion for this country. And this love affair was finally consummated on July 4th, 2011, when Simon became an American citizen. Before that, Queen Elizabeth honored him with naming him an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. Simon Winchester, OBE, is the way his name is written. But even Queen Elizabeth couldn't keep his loyalty to his home country with that OBE. But he still carries it around, right? Yeah. Despite all of his successes as an author, journalism still runs in Simon's blood. 3 years ago, he, along with several others, started a monthly newspaper in Stansfield, Massachusetts, which is a 250-year-old town in the Berkshires where he now lives. And then following the birth of the Stansfield Times, that was the name of the paper, Simon saw the growth of a new sense of community in this town of such diverse ethnicities as the descendants of the Puritan founders, along with Ukrainians, Hungarians, Albanians, and so on. But he saw this as sort of a microcosm of the binding together of a mongrel nation that he was writing about in, the men who united the states. So you're going to hear a lot of chapters of American history this evening, the kind of offbeat history that you won't find in history books. What Simon has consistently had his eye on is the strength of the connective tissue in a country so geographically and demographically diverse. And you'll love hearing what he's found. Simon is just the best storyteller, and I love it when he comes. So here's Simon.
Thank you so much. And the wonderful thing about it is that I came here I was in the Philadelphia Free Library yesterday, and I had to talk because it was a ticketed event, and they said, can you talk for an hour and a quarter? And I said, I'm delighted to do so. And you sort of wind me up, and I tend to go on and on and on. But when I came here tonight, I was told that really keep it to 30 minutes. And the nice thing was that the front matter of the talk that I gave yesterday is all about the background to the book, which you have so brilliantly encapsulated tonight. So you've done it's wonderful. So I can just cut to the chase, as it were, and give you the last 30 minutes of the Philadelphia story. But I do want to say this love affair business, which is entirely true, was consolidated by one particular event in the, I think it was the late 70s or the early 80s. I came back to America to work for a newspaper from 79 to 81. And this was back in the days when British newspaper and magazine editors spent money like drunken sailors, and any sort of idea that you came up with, particularly they were fascinated by America in those days too. If you came up with a good idea, they'd say, yes, go off and do it. And I don't know if you remember the movie Paris, Texas. Well, I was looking up in the Atlas. One of the great legacies of the Nixon administration is the National Atlas of the United States, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. And looking up, I wanted to see where Paris, Texas was. So I opened the index page to Paris and happened to see off to the left in another of the index columns a number of towns called Paradise, all in America. There were 18, as it turned out. And so I thought, well, that's rather interesting. It'd be fun to go to all the places called Paradise and find out why they were initially called Paradise and are they still Paradise. And so I rang up a gullible editor that I knew in London and I said, could I do this? And he said, yeah, absolutely fine. This is just great. So take 2 months or so to do it. And so I rented a car and started driving on this amazing journey, which began in Paradise, Florida, which was near Orlando, a retirement community, more a gateway to paradise than actually paradise itself. But and then Paradise, Pennsylvania, which is on Route 43, just down from Intercourse, Pennsylvania, and everyone, of course, in Britain thought that was frightfully exciting. And then there was Paradise, Arkansas, and Paradise, Montana, and they were all ruined in one way or another by depredations of modern society, except for one. And that was Paradise, Kansas, which is right in the middle of Kansas, just by Salina, so almost exactly in the geographical center of the continental United States. So I went, as I always did, to the postmaster, who was a woman, but as you probably know, postmasters, women are postmasters as well as men, not postmistresses, as in Britain. And I said, I'm an English journalist, and I'm here to write about all the places called Paradise. And she said, well, in that case, you must go to and probably stay with the patriarchs of this village, who, believe it or not, are called John and Mary Angel. So I'm serious. So I stayed with the Angels of Paradise, and Mrs. Angel had a cherry tree at the bottom of the garden, and she did pick cherries and bake them into a pie. And I think all my delight in coming to the States and hitchhiking around it, and all the generosity and everything that I encountered in the 60s and then again in the early 70s, was absolutely cemented by the experience of eating cherry pie with the angels in paradise. I couldn't have wished for anything greater. So I then went off to live in other countries, India and China for a while, and then came back in 97 after Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule. And then there was a fork in the road moment of whether I should go to London or New York, and I decided to go to New York. And then, as Barbara summarized, I suppose the reason was the old mantra of no taxation without representation, and I was paying taxes, so why couldn't I vote the rascals out or in or whatever? So I then applied for the green card and then eventually for citizenship, and I nearly screwed it up because they ask you 10, I don't know if there are any naturalized citizens here tonight, but they ask you 10 questions. They also make you, write a sentence in English and count to 10 and so forth. But they asked these 10 questions, and the first one I managed, well, they also said, are you willing to give up your OBE? OBE is said to mean the officer of the British Empire, but most Brits say it actually means other buggers' efforts. But he said to me very sternly, are you willing to give up your OBE? Because when you become an American, you're not supposed to serve any foreign prince or potentate, and the Queen is apparently a potentate. So who knew? But I said, well, of course. I mean, I want to be an American, so of course I'm willing. He said, well, we won't ask you to give it up, but that was a test, we need to know that you're willing. And then he asked me these 10 general knowledge questions, and the first, as I say, I screwed up, which was, and you'll be horrified to hear this, what is the American national anthem? And I blurted out, without thinking, America the Beautiful, and there was this horrible pause, and he said, I'm afraid we wish it were America, but it's actually this unsingable Star-Spangled Banner, so we've got 9 more chances, so you better get the rest of them. So then I became a citizen and then decided that I should write a book about America. But I should say that it's not the first book, it's actually the second book, because in 1976 I wrote a monumentally unsuccessful book. I had this very naive belief that the essence of America, the quiddity of the country, lay in the Midwest, and so I spent a lot of time driving up and down I-35 between International Falls and Laredo, and wrote a book which was politely, I wouldn't say enthusiastically, but politely reviewed, but in fact only sold 12 copies. And although William Least Heat Moon wrote to me a few years ago and said he had actually bought another. So the total sales were 13. So when I came to write this new book, the one driving imperative behind it was that it should be a book incredibly different from the one that I had written in 1976, because I hoped I might have learned my lesson. So I came up with all sorts of ideas. I mean, all I wanted, my initial thought was I just want to write a book about America. And so various ideas came and went. And when you say an idea, it actually means you've got to write a 20 or 30 page proposal, and so it takes a bit of thought. And so the first one was a sort of love letter to the country, and they thought that wasn't a good idea. And then I thought I love railway trains, so I'd ride across the country on class 3 railways, which you can do, little mom and pop freight lines, which you can go from Eastport in Maine to a place in Northern California, but they thought that would be a book about railways, not about America. And then I had this I was getting desperate, as you can probably tell, and I came up with this idea of writing a book called The Anatomy of America, basing it on Grey's Anatomy. Not the television program, which actually I've never seen, but the book. So I got the 1858 edition of Grey's Anatomy, and it seemed that it was worth a try anyway, because the brain would be the universities, and the nerves would be the communications, and the highways would be the arteries, and the skeleton would be the cement and the ironworks and everything. But they thought this was just a ludicrous idea, and that it would be picked apart by the critics. And so then I was fixated briefly. Then I was just thinking, what on earth can I do? And I suddenly became aware of this word, united. How had America managed to remain so pretty comprehensively united, apart, of course, from the unpleasantness of the 1860s, more or less ever since it was founded? And obviously I'm aware of Texas, and indeed the place I stay in London, I have to walk through the passage where there's a blue plaque which says this is the site of the embassy of the Republic of Texas that once was. So it hasn't been entirely united, but generally speaking, I mean, if you compare it to any other big national entity in the world, it's a great deal more united than, say, Canada, which has this sort of grumpy francophone bloc in the middle of it. Russia, which is, since the end of the Soviet Union, has broken into lots of little states. Europe, where I'm from, cannot get its act together. I mean, we don't use the euro. The Swiss aren't a member. If you plug in a shavering thing in Stockholm, you'll need a different plug from the one in Madrid, and everyone jabbers away in different languages. But this country, it's all managed to be the same. And it's obviously, you'll have to excuse my phone, but I have the reason for keeping it on is that I'm actually going to play you a piece of music in a moment, which is sort of important to the story. But the risk of keeping it on, of course, is that there'll be a Rudolph Giuliani moment, and someone will call, and I'll have to say, I'm really sorry. Anyway, let's hope nobody calls. I've sort of told everyone not to call. So, you know, when you've got a country like Norway, where everyone's Norwegian, or Japan, where my wife's from, and everyone's Japanese, unity is a relatively easy thing to create and preserve. But in a mishmash, mongrel amalgam of all sorts of people, it's not so easy. And you can say that abstract ideas keep the country together, you know, democracy or the English language or belief in human rights. But I came up with the thought that actually it's the deliberate agency of man. People invented things and created structures and systems that have managed to do this uniting. And so I was making a list of all the people, starting really with Lewis and Clark, and bringing it up to the present day, who I thought had played a role in annealing this country into one. And the list, most of them were forgotten figures. You know, there are a few very well-known figures, people like Samuel Morse and Jefferson, of course. But most had been forgotten, and I was encouraged by that, because I thought it'd be nice to shine the light on people that did great things but were forgotten. And one day I had made, maybe the list was about 100 people, and I said, or my wife came into the study and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I sort of explained what I've just explained. And she said, "Oh, you're making a list of the men who united the states." And I said, "This is wonderful. You've given me the title." Because I then went immediately to Amazon and Alibris and ABE Books and all the university libraries that I could find, and no one has used that title. It's such an obvious title. And once you've got the title in front of you, that sort of concentrates the mind wonderfully. So, but then there was the question of how you organize it. So I've got this big list, and you've got the idea. And I've always thought, I mean, whenever I teach non-fiction writing, which isn't very often, but when I do, it seems that the three keys to a book like this are the idea is king. Good writing is a nice thing to have, but it's not the second most important thing. The second most important thing is the book's structure. I mean, you can write lyrically about a brilliant idea, but if the structure's somehow out of kilter, people will go to sleep. And so the structure was important, and how could you do it? And I thought, well, I didn't really think about it. I dismissed it immediately. You could, these 100 or so names, you could arrange alphabetically, but I mean, then it would read like an encyclopedia. You could put them chronologically, which would have a sort of narrative flow to it, but once again, it would be catalogue-like rather than book-like. And then I was writing a letter to a friend of mine in Shanghai, and I had lived in China for a while, as I mentioned, and we were writing to each other about the use of the 5 classical elements in Chinese philosophy. I mean, from every country, from India eastwards, really, it seems that at the base of their philosophical structure of the society, there are usually, sometimes 4, but usually 5 elements. And the Chinese in particular base a lot of their thinking on the interlinking of these 5 things, which are, as I'm sure you all know, wood, earth, water, fire, and metal. And suddenly, in a sort of epiphany, I thought I can possibly corral these people that I've got on this list in front of me into a structure based on these 5 elements. And just to give you an example, and they all seem to be chronologically overlapping. Wood comes first, because here you've got Lewis and Clark. They were sent off in 1803, as everyone will know, by Thomas Jefferson, who was a man obsessed by trees. I mean, if you go to Monticello and see the trees that he planted in Monticello, what he wrote about trees, he regarded them as his pets. He loved trees. He looked from the terrace in Monticello over the Blue Ridge Mountains, which he never crossed, despite having gone to Paris, and he never went west of the Blue Ridge. And they were covered with trees. When he sent Lewis off, who then connected with Clark, and they went to St. Charles, Missouri, to really begin the expedition. To get there, they had to go through essentially 800 miles of primitive American forest of oak and cottonwood and all these other good things, elms and so forth. And then they were in wooden canoes. They built wooden palisades. They had campfires. Wood was a dominant theme of the early American explorers, and it seemed reasonable then to write about them in the context, using this Chinese analogy, of wood. Then earth, once the country had been, we knew the extent of it, we knew, thanks to Lewis and Clark and other expeditions, where the Rockies were, where the Sierra were, how far away the Pacific was, the great rivers and so forth. Then we needed to know what the country was made of. And so off went the early geologists. And actually it was at that moment that I had my comeuppance, because I had written a book in, I think, 2000 or 2001 called The Map That Changed the World, which was about an overlooked but I think great heroic figure called William Smith, who had created the first ever geological map of the world in 1815. At least so I thought. Well, it's right that he created it, but it turns out not to have been the first. The first was a geological map of this country, created by a Scotsman living in Philadelphia in 1809. He was called William McClure. So the publishers in England, ever eager to make a buck, have thought that they're going to relaunch the map that changed the world by putting the second map that changed the world, hope to milk it for a little bit more. So if you do see that, don't be fooled. Well, do be fooled, actually, because it do with the revenue. So he did a geological map, then early geologists and topographers from West Point, when West Point was largely an engineering school, not the school devoted to war making as it has been recently. They went out, they lured the pioneers with stories of farmland or coal or diamonds or gold or all these other things. And then there were the 4 great surveys of this country ordered by Lincoln, when you think he'd have other things on his mind, one of which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a few moments. So that chapter works very well in not the delineation of the country, but the description of that country under the rubric of earth. Then the next element is water. Well, the early settlers, they would penetrate the interior of the country from the eastern settlements going up the rivers, the James, the Rappahannock, the Susquehanna, the Potomac, the Hudson. And at each place they would, after 50 or 60 miles, would encounter rapids and waterfalls, the so-called fall line, where the Appalachians meet the coastal plains, and they had to stop there. build settlements, which then in turn, of course, turned into Richmond and Fredericksburg and Washington, D.C. and Albany. And then to get round them, once they had consolidated a town and were trading with people on the other side, they would have to build primitive canals. So then they became accustomed to building canals and started building proper canals, the Middlesex Canal in New Hampshire and northeastern Massachusetts, which essentially gave rise to Boston as a great mercantile trading city, the most important of all American canals, with the Erie Canal. When I remember as an 11-year-old schoolboy, my geography teacher at school in England, Harold Mann, would go on and on about writing essays about the importance of the Hudson Mohawk Gap. I mean, every English schoolchild was familiar with that. Nowadays, people shake their heads and say, what the hell is it? Well, it's really important, I promise you. And it's the way that the track of the Erie Canal, which of course made New York the great mercantile center that it is today. And then the canals to link Chicago to the Mississippi, so the Illinois and Michigan, and the unhappily titled Chicago Sanitary Canal, which was built to get Chicago's sewage no longer tipped into the lake, but actually tipped westwards to places where they didn't care about so much. But actually also took great ships, which could then go down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And that, of course, you end that particular story with the canalization and taming, if it can ever be tamed, of the Mississippi. So that all worked in water. Well, going up rivers was necessarily a rather slow business. And by this period in American history, sort of the 1840s, 1850s, the degree of commerce was getting, the pace of it was picking up, and people wanted to get across the country rapidly. And James Watt had invented the steam engine, so let's produce machines that run based on fire, on the expansion of water into steam. And so this gives rise to the railway, and then ultimately other sorts of engines, the motor car, the building of the interstate highway system, the first flights across America. So all of that works neatly under the rubric of fire. And then finally metal, well, that's the metal wire of the telegraph system, and then the distribution of electricity, radio, television, and the internet. So the five elements did seem to work rather well, and wood certainly comes before earth, which becomes before water, which becomes before fire, which finishes with metal, because obviously the internet is propelling us in tomorrow. So I saw my editor and said, this is the structure I'd like for the book. And he said he was a bit wary, because he said Americans might be a little sort of uneasy with having their country, or my country, I suppose, viewed through the prism of Chinese culture. And so we are a little concerned. And the book has now been out for a week. I think exactly it came out a week ago. And mercifully, the critics thus far have been kind. And with the news that I just got an hour ago about it getting onto the Times bestseller list, it seems, this is going to sound glib, but it's not meant to sound glib. I think I've gotten away with it. You know, the structure has been accepted, and that's not going to be a topic of conversation. So what I thought I'd do very briefly, because I'm aware that we don't have a great deal of time, it's a great sort of plum pudding of a book with lots of odd things in it, mainly things that, well, most things that I didn't know about at all. And when I've tested these things in people on audiences, they haven't known them very well either. I think the first question I'm going to ask you was known by 3 people at the Boston Athenaeum, no one in New York, you'll be relieved to know, 2 people last night in Philadelphia. So see if you can do any better. Who here knows anything about, and if you all put up your hands, I'll be horribly embarrassed, the town of East Liverpool, Ohio? One, you know where it is. Well, but do you know why, don't please, if you do know why it's, in my view, one of the most important places in American history, please don't tell me, because I want to tell you. Thank you so much. Great. Well, East Liverpool is you've probably all got products in your house that were made in East Liverpool, because this town, which is a forlorn, broken down, rust belt city on the west bank of the Ohio River, essentially at the place where Ohio, Pennsylvania, and that little sliver of West Virginia meet. It was the crockery capital of America. Nearly all plates and cups and saucers and teapots and coffee pots were made there. Not anymore, though. There were 400 kilns, but now I think there are 2. It's a very sad, broken down, typical, Eastern Ohio, former industrial town. But it's important for a completely different reason. And the importance stems from the existence, if you drive on Ohio Route 39 eastwards towards the bridge which leads you into Pennsylvania. Beside the road, surrounded by litter, covered with graffiti, is an obelisk. And that obelisk is a hugely important part of the story of early America, because it goes back to 1785, and it goes back to Thomas Jefferson, actually, and an act he managed to get ramrodded through Congress, which performed a profound change on this newly born country. And that was that it allowed Americans to own land. It was the tradition back in England, and in most European pre-revolutionary countries anyway, was that the land was generally owned by the monarch or the church or the aristocracy, and that the ordinary people were tenants. And Jefferson thought this was entirely wrong, and he said that people ought to be able to own land in America, certainly when it was being settled west of the Ohio River. And so the ordinance was passed, and the idea was that if you owned land, you could improve it, you could build on it, the agricultural products would be your own, you could sell it, you could buy it, you could trade it, and the government could levy taxes on it, thereby raising taxes to administer the country. But to sell this land, this vast tract that Lewis and Clark had trekked over and the geologists had found out what was there, you needed to survey it. You needed to organize it into what we know now are sections and townships and ranges, those big squares, when you fly over to the West Coast and you're bored and you look out of the window and you see you're in Nebraska or Kansas or Arizona or Nevada, you see these north-south lines, the east-west lines, and you count how fast the lines, because they're a mile apart, and you can easily therefore tell how fast your aeroplane is going. And those lines, they all had a place where they originated, because the first surveyor, appointed on Jefferson's watch, essentially, the geographer of the United States said, we've got to draw a north-south line, and we've got to intersect an east-west, a base meridian, a baseline and a north-south meridian, and where they meet is the point of beginning, the beginning of America. And that place is in East Liverpool, Ohio. That obelisk that I mentioned is it. It is the point of beginning for America. And to me, it seems scandalous that it's bypassed by trucks. It's beside a warehouse for fracking material. It couldn't look less distinguished. No one stops. I think it should have parking for buses. There should be an air-conditioned interpretive center. Every school child in America should be taken here, because the basis of early America is writ large there on this undistinguished obelisk, the point of beginning of America. That's one thing I didn't know about, and evidently nor did many of you. I'm thrilled. I mentioned earlier the 4 great surveys that were done in the 1860s. These are all geologists, so people dear to my heart, because I was a sort of geologist once. Their names, some of them will be familiar to you. Wheeler, probably not particularly. He surveyed much of the Dakotas and Nebraska. He sort of got the short end of the stick, and he's not very well remembered. 2, quite famous. Hayden, who discovered and mapped Yellowstone, and John Wesley Powell, who, despite only having one arm, which was shot off at the Battle of Shiloh, went all the way down, mapping the Grand Canyon. And I think, parenthetically, those 2, Powell and Hayden, would have been spinning in their graves last week if they imagined that the national parks that they essentially gifted to their country had been closed because of this I won't say it's a trivial dispute, because I'm in Washington, this profound and monumentally dispute that racked the Capitol. But I think they would have been terribly upset. But the 4th guy is the one I want to talk about. Some of you will know, because there was a book about him recently, but he's called Clarence King. And you know of his story. Well, I'm just going to recapitulate it for people that don't know it, because I thought it was fascinating. Clarence King was a diminutive, well-born Newport, Rhode Island wasp. He came from a good family. He was well connected. He was a friend of Henry Adams. He was a friend of John Hay. He did a geology degree, I think, if I got it right, at Yale, and then a PhD at Harvard, and was appointed on Lincoln's instructions to take charge of one of these 4 great surveys, the survey known as the 40th Parallel Survey, which it was a line running from essentially Sacramento in the west to Cheyenne in the east, and 100 miles north and south of that line, essentially the route of the the new to be built Union Pacific Railway. So it took him 7 years to do this. He had a team of fellow geologists, and the work was stupendous. I mean, it was just, you can buy the reports of the Clarence King 40th parallel survey for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're beautiful maps, impeccably written reports. And as a consequence of so successfully accomplishing the 40th parallel survey, he was made the first ever director of the United States Geological Survey, a body which still exists today. Powell was made the second director, but King distinguished by being the first director of the USGS. So that's his professional life encapsulated. His personal life, though, was something very different. He was a diminutive man, as I said, bearded, loquacious, amusing. He loved women, but he did not, and I hope no one will find this offensive, he didn't like white women at all. He thought they were tedious in the extreme. And I am sorry. He loved Native American women, and he really loved black women. This was, so you've read the book, right. It's called Passing Strange. It came out 3 or 4 years ago. And the incident which sort of tipped the balance was late on in his years when he was walking through Riverside Park in New York, and he saw coming towards him a black lady, and it was a coup de foudre. He saw her and he said, "This is the woman of my dreams." And he went up to her, and what he should have said, probably, was, "Good evening. I am Clarence King. I am the director of the United States Geological Survey, and would you care to have dinner with me?" But in fact, thinking perhaps a little too fast on his feet, he said, "Good evening. I am," and goodness knows where the name came from, he said, "I am James Todd. And although I look white, I'm actually black, and I'm a porter on the Pullman Railway Company. Will you have dinner with me?" And she was called Ada Copeland. She came from Chattahoochee in Georgia, from a slave family. She said, "Why, yes." They went and had dinner. They fell in love. They married. They had 5 children. He, from that moment on, lived 2 entirely separate lives, not telling the one about the other and vice versa. His wife and 2 of the children were unaccountably, at least unaccountably to her, as white as the driven snow. They settled down in Queens in New York, and he would say to her every so often, "Right, my dear, well, I've just been summoned to go off on the 20th Century Limited or the California Zephyr, so see you in 2 weeks." And he walked from his house across the newly built Brooklyn Bridge to the offices of the geologists in Manhattan and said, "Well, that was a pretty tough field trip. Now I better stay and write up my notes." And wrote up his notes for 2 weeks and then said, "Well, goodbye, I've got to go off on another little expedition," walked back across the Brooklyn Bridge and reassumed his identity as James Todd, saw Mrs. Todd and the little Todd children and showed the tips that he had got on the railway journey. And this fiction went on for 20 years. It was unbelievable that he managed to sustain it. It cost him a fortune. He had to borrow money from John Hay, who was by then Secretary of State. And he also went completely loopy at one stage in his career and got into a fist fight with someone outside the lion cage at the Central Park Zoo and had to be put into an asylum. And then after 20 years of this extraordinary double life, he then fell ill and he had tuberculosis and was brought down to Albuquerque to recuperate, but in fact didn't recover and was on his deathbed. He confessed to his doctor and said, "Would you kindly get in touch with Mrs. Todd in Queens and tell her that her name is actually Mrs. King, and that the husband who sort of suggested he was a little bit black is in fact totally white, will explain the 2 children." And then he died. But the sort of slightly charming coda to this all is that the death certificate, which I've seen, the doctor, in race of the deceased, scored out the words black and white and simply wrote in his own handwriting the word American, which seemed to be a nice solution to it all. I'm hearing noises from you. Are you getting restless? I mean, do you want me to shut up? Because I'm just very aware that this 30 minutes, but I won't be much longer, but I wanted just 2 other things, one of which will be this little musical interlude. I became fascinated with the distribution of electricity in this country because it seems to me a very unifying thing. And I'm sure you all know the basis of it, that electricity was initially DC, direct current, invented by Edison, founder of General Electric, the company we love so much. And he set up his first power station in Pearl Street in Manhattan. But the thing about DC is that the further you are from the power station, the less power. And so light bulbs that glow white near Pearl Street would glow yellow half a mile away. And then Nicola Tesla, another great unsung hero of the American story, invented alternating current. George Westinghouse bought the patent. And then there was this tremendous tussle between Westinghouse and Edison, the battle of the currents. And Edison, as I'm sure you know, tried to prove that AC was very dangerous. And one of the ways he attempted to demonstrate its dangers was by electrocuting an elephant. And he did this. There's a film. I mean, you probably see it on YouTube. It's quite distressing if you feel squeamish about electrocuting elephants. Basically, she was called Topsy, and she worked at the in Coney Island, and she had attacked and indeed killed, I think, a keeper, but hardly surprisingly, because the keeper had been feeding her lighted cigarettes, which you'd think would be a good reason for being stomped to death. So Edison decided that this Topsy would be ideal creature to show how dangerous AC was. So he made special elephant boots out of copper, so copper cylinders, which the elephant put on its feet, or were put on the elephant's feet, and then walked him onto an iron plate, making 100% certain that she would die by feeding her lunch of carrots laced with cyanide. And then, but you see her in the film standing there, and they pull the lever. And it is really quite distressing. You see the elephant's legs begin to smoke, and then she topples over 2.5 tons or something. And anyway, but nonetheless, this didn't convince the American people that AC was dangerous, and AC became the kind of electricity that was distributed. But it was only distributed to the cities and to the suburbs and the farms, of which there were huge numbers in the 1920s and 30s, because the population was growing and people needed beef and corn and wheat and so forth. There were, I think, 800,000 farms in America that were not connected to power. And the reason I mention it, I mean, I tell the stories of wonderful eyewitness stories of farmers paying the $5 to join the co-op, and then the REA, which is the agency set up by Roosevelt during the New Deal, the wires coming to their houses, and the moment the lights came on. It's beautiful, poetic stuff. But I just love the fact that the first place in America, the first farms in America to get distributed electricity as a direct result of FDR government program were in western Ohio, specifically in the city, or in the farms outside the city of Miami, Ohio. And a part of the country which is the 8th congressional district of Ohio, which is the constituency represented today by John Boehner. I just think it's a wonderful irony that this archetype foe of big government represents a part of America which got the greatest and first benefit from the biggest big government America has ever seen. However, the one final thing I wanted to mention is completely non-political, and that's the radio as a unifying feature. I think of all the new technologies, I mean, we all know that Morse, and that famous patent 1647, when Morse invented the telegraph and then started sending messages, that bound the country together. But somehow binding it together with people, with the human voice, created cultural as well as national unity. And I think the image that we see often from the 1930s and 40s of the family gathered round the walnut panelled radio set, mother and father, children, dogs, cats and things, listening all to the same program, the NBC Symphony Orchestra from New York, or a comedy program from Los Angeles, or Orson Welles and War of the Worlds being broadcast from New Jersey and terrifying everybody. It offered an image of cultural and national unity at the same time. But how did that come about? Well, we all know how radio was invented. I mean, there's that wonderful image, isn't there, of Marconi sitting on Signal Hill in Newfoundland in 1902 with his aerial on a kite 500 feet above him, listening to what he hoped would be, there were his men 2,000 miles away in Cornwall, endlessly, night and day, tapping out the signal for the letter S in Morse, did it. And this went on for days, and he's up there listening, and there's the howling of the gale and the static and all the rest of it. And then suddenly, 2 o'clock in the morning, he hears ever so faintly, and he knows that radio can bridge an ocean and that everything is going to change as a consequence. So that's all fine and dandy. But and radio instantly took off as a very useful tool. But it wasn't going to enhance any sort of national cultural conversation, because people aren't going to communicate with each other in Morse code. What was necessary was that radio should be able to transmit the human voice. And that's all down to a man who's largely forgotten, called Reginald Fessenden. And he was a remarkable fellow, a big, bluff, bearded Canadian from Nova Scotia, I think, who worked for the American Weather Bureau down here in Washington. And he worked out, he was a technical man, and he worked out, well, he gave us the inventions that you'll know the initials of, AM and FM, amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, which basically allowed me to bolt onto a radio transmitter, not just a Morse tapper, but a microphone like this, such that anything that was heard through the microphone could be transmitted wirelessly. And this was a huge breakthrough. So he first tested his transmitter. He built a huge aerial in a place called Brant Rock, Massachusetts, and another one over in Argyll in Scotland, and it worked. So then he decided to unleash it on the public. And what he did was, a couple of days before Christmas, 1906, he sent a message in Morse code, of course, to all the radio operators of all the ships that belonged to the United Fruit Company that were bringing bananas up from ports, places like Tegucigalpa in Honduras, to the American ports, Savannah, Charleston, Baltimore, Boston, New York, to listen out at 1 minute to midnight on Christmas Eve for a broadcast. He didn't say anything more than that, just listen. And as it happened, that night, Christmas Eve, 1906, it was a classically dark and stormy night. There was a vicious snowstorm blowing off Cape Cod. And you can imagine these little ships rolling in these immense storms, ploughing their way northwards to deliver fruit to the American public, and the radio operators on instructions going down to their radio cabins and putting on their earphones and listening. First of all, they just heard static, and they heard the other Morse chatter of other ships talking to one another. And then, if this works, they heard this. That was Emmy Leisner singing Ombre My Fou, which has nothing, of course, to do with America. It's all about a Persian king and a shade tree. But from Handel's Xerxes opera, when that faded away, to the astonishment of everyone at sea, then Aubrey Fessenden came on, or Reginald Fessenden came on, and read the Lord's Prayer, and then said a very happy Christmas to you all. And thus ended the first ever transmission. And suddenly everything changed, because within a few days, a little radio station using the same technology opened above a musical instrument store, which still exists in Pasadena in California. And an aerial was put up in a wheat field in Madison, Wisconsin, and WHA, the first radio station in this country, got underway. And with that one transmission on Christmas Eve of that singer singing that beautiful aria, so the national unifying radio conversation began. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much indeed.
Okay, we've got two mics, one here and one here.
Hi, that was fascinating.
Hello.
Is this on?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. Yes.
Okay, fine. You've been here for a couple of decades, and you've documented how we were united for 200 years, except for the Civil War. Do you think we are less united now?
To be perfectly honest, I don't. I think, and I write about this in some detail in the fifth part of the book, about how cable television, first of all, when it was invented in West Virginia in the 70s, and now the internet, is dividing us up culturally into a lot of special interest groups. And, that old image of the family around the radio set no longer obtains, really. So to that extent, I think that is maybe a retrograde step. But in all other ways, I think America shows it can and will continue to pull together and will see itself through all these various problems. I mean, I'm a great optimist that this country, for all its defects and for all its Ted Cruz, I'm sorry, for all its, I didn't mean that, for all its, it'll rise above them. I mean, after all, it got through the Civil War, it got through, I mean, such lunacies as prohibition. I mean, how that ever happened, I don't know. It got through the Depression, it got through the Dust Bowl, it got through the Great Recession, and it'll get through the problems that it's going through on Capitol Hill today. So I think America is, I mean, I know that particularly internationally, people are sneering at America, but everything will be all right, I'm certain. And this book, in a way, I think illustrates that that it has been in the past, and there are certain great strengths about this country which are unbreakable.
Well, I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right too. I choose to live here for some while yet to come, I hope.
You make the point about radio, and radio is about language, and I mean, English, for better or for worse, has been the lingua franca and the great unifying thing of this country,
Right.
one of many. My parents were immigrants. I came here, I studied English in school, and I'm American. There's a lot of parts of the country right now which are effectively bilingual. Schooling, there's a lot of people saying you should school in Spanish, you should school in other languages. How do you see this country basically evolving now into a multilingual sort of society affecting the unity of the country, if at all? I mean, it may be actually helping it in many ways.
Well, and this isn't entirely answering your question, I have been involved to a large extent in this, in the latter years anyway, in the construction of this dictionary in Madison, Wisconsin, called the Dictionary of American Regional English, DARE, which its sixth and final volume has just been published. It's a remarkable achievement. It's taken 60 years to make, showing how the language, although we speak and listen to the equivalent of what's known in England anyway, standard received English. But out in the hollers and the byways and the backcountry of America, there's whole different vocabularies and whole different accents, and which is the reason for this extraordinary 6-volume book which chronicles it all. So I think linguistic, dialectic variations within the country only add to the cultural richness of the country. But I think the implied question, I think, here is the huge number of Hispanic and Hispanic-only speaking population a good or a bad thing? And I must say, I think it's troublesome. I think a unifying language is a very important unifying feature of a country. And I would like to see in those parts of the country where English is losing ground, some effort educationally or maybe even legislatively to regain that ground. But it's a tricky subject, but I can't but think that it's not a good thing, and that English should be after all, it nearly wasn't, as we know. We might have been speaking German, but I mean because of decisions taken in the 1780s. But we are speaking English, and I think that should be the dominant language for a long, long time to come.
Thank you.
Hi, Simon.
Hello.
Good evening. I was in my office, and I told my young colleague that I was coming to see Simon in Winchester and to hear you speak. And she said, she went to Wikipedia. He's written so many books. If I can only read one of his books, which one should I read? So I wanted to ask you that question for her.
Ah, right.
I told her I would ask you that question.
It's difficult because, I mean, The Professor and the Madman is my bank manager's favorite book, if I can put it like that. Because, I mean, this was a book which they printed 10,000 copies. They thought, who on earth is going to read a book about 19th century lexicography? But it did extraordinarily and surprisingly well. So my favorite book, though, is one which came before that and was not a great success, and it remains, I think, my favorite. And that was a book about the Yangtze River in China called The River at the Center of the World. So as a sort of a combination of, because I used to sort of be a travel writer, and that, I think, it tells reasonably vividly what China's all about. It's not just about the Yangtze. And I think it's important that we learn about China. So I would say, tell her to read both. Do a twofer. I'm sure Amazon will give you a two for one. Amazon, what am I saying? I'm sure in this bookstore.
Thanks.
Whoa, stop it.
Thanks.
Sure.
So do you get in a Winnebago and drive back and forth across the country, or do you sit in your office and use Google Maps? I'm just wondering, how do you do this incredible research?
Well, I mean, as a case in point, and the answer is the first, not the second. I mean, I just love getting around, and I'm sure the conventional belief is that the interstate highway system is called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System because Eisenhower had the idea when he saw the German Autobahns when he was in Europe after World War II. Well, that's not the case. Eisenhower got this idea that America needed a great road network in 1919 when he was a young major assigned to a National War College funded expedition to find out how rapidly troops could be sent by road from the South Lawn of the White House, where there's a memorial to this day, to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. And basically the generals had come up with the idea that the Japanese in the Pacific were getting restless. They'd already defeated Russia, after all, and that treaty was signed in New Hampshire, as you know. And they may well start casting their eyes eastward to the American coast, and of course, which is what they did in 1941. Not the coast, but Hawaii. How rapidly can we get soldiers to deal with this problem? So they assembled a convoy of tanks and armored cars and commissary wagons and ambulances and so forth and jeeps. And they set off on essentially what is now US Route 30, the Lincoln Highway. But once they passed Omaha, there were essentially no roads. And so tanks got bogged down in sand and bridges were broken and all sorts of mechanical problems developed. So it took them 58 days to get across the country at an average speed of just under 6 miles an hour. If the Japanese had invaded, they would have taken California, Arizona, New Mexico. They might have even been nibbling away at West Texas, which might not have been altogether too bad a thing, I've always thought. But and Eisenhower kept a meticulous diary of this. And so I got hold of his diary and decided to follow in his footsteps. So I loaded up my car with a tent and sleeping bags and decided that everywhere they had been, I would go. And the joy to me was that this fulfilled an ambition I'd had for years, which was to go to the town of Denison, Iowa, because that was the birthplace of the woman that I had considered from my teenage years to be the most wonderful woman in creation. And she was born Donna Mullinger, and she took the screen name of Donna Reed. And I saw as a child It's a Wonderful Life, and I fell in love with this woman. And so I was so thrilled that the Eisenhower expedition did indeed stop in Denison, which allowed me to spend the night communing with the ghost of my long-lost love. Hello.
Hi, I just want to thank you so much for coming. Your voice has been an ever-present on road trips with my family over the years. And I have to say the first book that we listened to was A Crack in the Earth. And I really appreciate the depth in the geology and the science. And I've learned so much about the scientific process in the meetings. Is that something that, as a journalist, you try to stay abreast of current science and some of the controversies in terms of like climate change and just geology as a general field?
Certainly geology. I mean, I got my finger slightly burned in the whole climate question when I wrote about, the last book was about the Atlantic Ocean, and I deliberately didn't come down on either side because most geologists see what's happening as a cyclical event and don't buy into the UN climate panel and so on and so forth. But I did manage to get in, I think, 3 pages of what would happen to the New York subway system in the event of a big tide surge, and I was, sort of vindicated by Sandy. Everyone doesn't like to say that, so I do try and keep abreast. But the academic community can be very waspish about you getting into their fields, and so I have to balance. I mean, many academics do not like generalists, popularizers, to be muddying the field, and so I have to deal with that as well. I do my best and don't always please them.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
For one last question over here.
Hi, I'm one of the people that contributed to the smile on your bank manager's face.
Thank you so much.
And it wasn't too long ago you were here speaking about your book, Atlantic. And I'm just totally baffled by how you can come up with another great product in such a short period of time.
Is that a criticism?
No, that is. I very much enjoy listening to you. You speak so well. You're very entertaining, as is evidenced by the response from the crowd.
It's very nice of you to say so. And I'm just to add to your dismay or whatever. I'm now doing a book on the Pacific, so we're going to try and turn it into a trilogy: Atlantic, the middle bit, you, us, and then the Pacific. So
3 strikes.
But possibly, yes.
But,
well, that's very kind of you.
But the question remains: how do you manage to have all this excellent production in such a short period of time?
I honestly, I can't tell you. I mean, I live a normal life like everybody else. Someone said that you don't drink or you don't watch television, but I do. I drink and watch television. So,
well, it is after prohibition.
Yeah, thank heavens, thank heavens. Well, look, thank you very much indeed. That was very kind of you. Thank you.